Anticipating a Japanese invasion of British India via the eastern border of Bengal, the British military launched a preemptive two-pronged scorched earth initiative in eastern and coastal Bengal. Its goal was to deny the expected invaders access to food supplies, transport, and other resources. First, a denial of rice policy was carried out in 3 southern districts along the coast of the Bay of Bengal. Issued directive requiring stocks of paddy, unmilled rice, deemed surplus, and other food items to be removed or destroyed in these districts. Evidence that fraudulent, corrupt, and coercive practices by the purchasing agents removed far more rice than officially recorded, not only from designated districts, but also in unauthorized areas, suggests a greater impact. Had a freeze, restricted the flow of rice into trade. Boat denial policy, deny Bengali transport to any invading Japanese army. Confiscated about 45,000 rural boats, severely disrupting riverborne movement of labor, supplies, and food, compromising the livelihood of boatmen and fishermen, broke the economy of the fishing class. The large-scale removal or destruction of rural boats caused a near-complete breakdown of the existing transport and administration infrastructure and market system for movement of rice paddy. No steps were taken to provide for the maintenance or repair of the confiscated boats. Many fishermen were unable to return to their trade. The army took no steps to distribute food rations to make up for the interruption of supplies. Dude. Oh, my God. Wow. So, fearing an incoming Japanese invasion, they just fucking destroyed and confiscated a fuck ton of food and then kept people from traveling along the river, which was how they got their food and moved around. Provincial trade barriers preventing trade in domestic rice. Anxiety and soaring rice prices triggered by the fall of Burma. Trade barriers prevented the flow of food grains, especially rice and other goods, from moving between provinces. Punjab banned exports of wheat. The Famine Inquiry Commission of 1945 characterized this, quote, critical and potentially most dangerous stage, end quote, as a key policy failure. As one deponent to the commission put it, every province, every district, every administrative division in the east of India had become a food republic unto itself. The trade machinery for the distribution of food between provinces throughout the east of India was slowly strangled, and by spring of 1943 was dead. Bengal was unable to import domestic rice. This policy helped transform market failures and food shortage into famine and widespread death. And then there was a natural disaster. Refusal of imports. Beginning as early as December 1942, high-ranking government officials and military officers began requesting food imports for India through government military channels, but for months these requests were either rejected or reduced to a fraction of the original amount by Churchill's war cabinet. Yeah, to understand how bad this was, the Raj government wanted imports. Like, as bad as the Raj government was, as the British colonial powers were, they were thinking like, wow, holy shit, we should really get some fucking food in here. And Churchill told them no. The colony was also not permitted to spend its own sterling reserves or even use its own ships to import food. Couldn't even spend its own money or use its own ships to import food. Extremely competent governance here. Very good, very smart, very necessary. Although Viceroy Linlithgow appealed for imports from mid-December 1942, he did so in the understanding that the military would be giving preference over civilians. The Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, was on one side of a cycle of requests for food aid and subsequent refusals from the British War Cabinet that continued through 1943 and into 1944. Amery did not mention worsening conditions in the countryside, stressing Calcutta's industries must be fed or its workers will return to the countryside. Rather than meeting this request, the UK promised a relatively small amount of wheat that was specifically intended for Western India, that is, not Bengal, in exchange for an increase in rice exports from Bengal to Ceylon. So the British government was like, oh, we'll give you some food as long as you put it in the parts of the country that aren't currently experiencing a famine and take more food from the famine-stricken area. This is not a matter of calling them incompetent, right? There was a lot of incompetence, but a lot of this was also just deliberate genocide. They did the same with the Irish people. Like, it's not like the British are unfamiliar with it, you know? The tone of Linlithgow's warnings to Emery grew increasingly serious through the first half of 1943, as did Emery's requests to the War Cabinet. Yeah, this is very... Yeah, exactly, Red Cascadian. This is very, very free market that we're looking at here. Like, no, you can't sell your sterling. No, you can't use your boats. No, you can't trade your grain. We're forcing you to export more grain from the famined area. No, you can't bring more grain in from other areas. Like, yeah, it's super duper like, yeah, they just bought it in the market, man. It's just totally... free market, you know? The cabinet again offered a relatively small amount, explicitly referring to it as a token shipment. His requests were again repeatedly denied, causing him to decry the current crisis as, quote, one of the greatest disasters that has befallen any people under British rule, and the damage to our reputation both among Indians and foreigners in India is incalculable. And you know what? He was right, Because after World War II, the British lost India and have never recovered. India was the jewel of the British colonial empire, and them losing it was literally the beginning of European decolonization. When they lost India, like that set off like the collapse of the British Empire, and then later, much later, the French Empire as well. France still has a shadow empire? Yes. An estimated 0.8 to 3.8 million Bengalis died out of a population of 60.3 million. The scholarly consensus is around 2.1 million, according to Irish historian. Jesus. Yeah. In case of one of the earlier famines the colonial rule caused, if I recall correctly, the Orissa famine, one administrator that actually did something to alleviate things in the area was chastised for, quote, interfering with the market. And next famine, he instead had people study, quote, how long can an Indian work during starvation? Yeah, that sounds about right. Why would the UK want to do all this? Because they were trying to extract as much wealth as possible from India, and because the British people and Churchill thought Indians were subhuman. That's it. Ideologically, there was really not that much separating the Nazis from the British concerning their respective colonial powers, you know? The only difference, really, is that the form of colonialism the Nazis decided to engage in was a lot more local. If the Nazis had gone abroad and found uncolonized portions of Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and had applied essentially the exact same policies and doctrines, there would have been very little fuss about it. I mean, to give you a good idea, hold on 1 second. When was the Japanese invasion of Manchuria? It began in 1931. 8 years before World War II began, the Japanese were slaughtering Chinese people. And did we care? No, because they were doing it to an uncivilized group of peasantry. We didn't care because they weren't fucking about with the European powers. Nobody gave a shit. Nobody. The Japanese were doing this for far longer than the Nazis were. They got started earlier. And that's because, at least initially, the Japanese had the good sense to contain their brutal genocidal policies to areas that the European powers didn't really care about. We did ban oil exports to them. How long did it take for us to do that? USA ban oil to Imperial Japan date. Oh, pretty 1 decade later in 1941. That was after World War II started. And that was because they were threatening the broader Pacific. We didn't give a shit about them slaughtering millions and millions of Chinese. I'm telling you, if the Nazis had done all of their Nazi shit in countries outside of Europe, we would not have cared, and they would not have been that different to what the Dutch or the Spanish or the French or the British had done. Indochina, it was in response to attacking French colonies. Was it really directly in response to that? Yep. In retaliation for the Japanese occupation of French Indochina, the only time after a decade of slaughtering Chinese, the only time we lifted a finger to stop, we were giving them oil and scrap metal for a decade of them genociding people in Manchuria, but they touched French Indochina, and that was when we lifted a finger. So you're saying the Nazis weren't uniquely evil? No, they weren't. Even a cursory reading of history tells us this. The reason they live as the spirit of evil in the Western imagination is not because they did anything that other governments hadn't done before. It's because they did it in our adjacency. We are not only tolerant of, but active enablers of Nazi-esque policy as long as it doesn't disrupt our backyard, as long as it doesn't fuck with our affairs. Now, admittedly, over the past 70 or 80 years, we have gotten a lot better. America today, at its worst, like the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, are incomparably better on an ethical level than what, the British were doing in India, or what the Nazis were doing, or what the Japanese were doing, or whatever. But it's still important to understand, you know? To be fair, America and Latin America got a lot better too. Yeah, no, we are far better now than we were then, and I think that's a meaningful distinction, you know? I think it's important to understand that. It's a lot harder to get away with mass death these days, and that's a good thing. It should be hard to get away with mass death. Was America the least evil in World War II? World War II, tons of countries participate, and I don't know. It's like a Reddit battle, you know, like who was the most or least. I don't know. Of the powers involved, the Nazis and the Japanese were by far the worst. So I am glad that they lost.